Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. You know, my wife and I both are still recovering from COVID, and it's really a strange deal. I've read about this and I've heard about this of how it seemed like every few days a different side effect, so to speak, kind of pops up. But overall, we're still improving. We're just so very, very thankful for that. The trouble of it is, as I've mentioned to you, neither one of us have any energy. I have to tell you, it's almost a strain to go ahead and produce videos. It's just like, oh man, I'm so tired. But I take a nap, I get up, then I want to take another nap. And it's just the way it is, from the side effects. But again, still improving and on the way up, and everything's going to be all right. So hope you had a fantastic weekend. Unfortunately, my Razorbacks lost to Alabama, kind of like everybody else does. But nonetheless, they made some real blunders in the game. They were doing really, really well. They had come back. They were, so to speak, within striking distance. And then all of a sudden, boom, Alabama exploded on them, as they have a tendency to do. So a lot of people were saying this was going to be the year that Arkansas finally beat Alabama after 15 straight losses, but it was not to be. There's always next year. Ooh, pig suey. So hope your team won. My wife's team, the OU Sooners, got absolutely destroyed by TCU. I don't remember a time when OU got absolutely decimated. They looked almost like a high school team. That just did not look good. So she was sad. I was sad. That's the way it is when you follow your college team. Well, let's get back into our study of the Olivet Discourse. We have been involved in a study for a good little while now, demonstrating that Matthew chapter 25 is the same coming of the Lord as Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31. It is the time of the vindication of the martyrs. And specifically, one of the ways we've been demonstrating that is that Matthew 25, 31 and following is the same coming of the Lord as Joel 2 through 3, where it predicted the last days, the day of the Lord, the gathering of the nations, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and Joel 3, 20 and 21, the time of the vindication of the martyrs. Now, everyone admits that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the time of the gathering of the nations. It's in the last days. It's at the day of the Lord. So, very clearly, Joel 2 and 3, Matthew 25, 31 and following are speaking of the same coming of the Lord. But, again, Joel is talking about the day of the Lord to vindicate the martyrs that Jesus emphatically, explicitly posited at the judgment of Jerusalem in the first century, Matthew 23, 29 and following. So another thing that we have been doing, and we've been involved in this for the last few weeks, is demonstrating that the coming of the Lord in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the same coming of the Lord as 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Now this is very, very troublesome for those who admit 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is in fact the coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Because here's what happens. In my exposition of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, I've had different people respond on YouTube and say, look, you can read Matthew 25, 31 and following over and over again. You won't find the word martyrs. You won't find the term martyr vindication. Well, that's true. But those same people turn right around and admit, yes, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25, 31. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is about martyr vindication. So even though Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following doesn't mention martyr vindication, since it is the parallel to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is about martyr vindication, that means that Matthew 25, 31 and following is about martyr vindication. And since 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 was fulfilled in the judgment of Israel in the first century, that means that Matthew 25, 31 and following was fulfilled in the judgment of Israel for judging or for persecuting the church in the first century. Now, over the last couple of weeks, I've shared with you a couple of arguments that have been set forth by opponents of covenant eschatology. We examined the argument by Steve Gregg, who denies that Paul was really talking about first century persecution per se. He denies that the Jews were the persecutors of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. He denies that Paul was offering the Thessalonians relief from their then ongoing persecution at the hands of the Jews. So again, Steve Gregg takes 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 completely out of its historical context, rips out the Thessalonians from being the subjects of the letter, and says that Paul is simply writing a generic letter about the promises of God to the church at the end of time. That doesn't work. Then, a couple of videos ago, I began to share with you the argument by Sam Frost. Sam Frost says 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is not about the coming of the Lord in the future of the Thessalonians. It is not about their vindication as martyrs. No, what Paul was really saying was that the Thessalonians were to take comfort in the fact that Jesus had ascended. Sam Frost changes the translation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and I pointed this out a couple of different times. There's not a single translation that I found, and you can go to Bible Gateway and look it up yourself, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7. I have not found a single translation that agrees with Sam Frost. Now, Sam Frost has set forth a unique, unprecedented argument. He is saying that Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, and he was not saying that God was going to repay with tribulation, lex talionis. He was not saying that God was going to give the persecutors of the Thessalonians what the persecutors were giving to the Thessalonians. No. He was not saying that God was going to give the Thessalonians relief from that persecution. No, not at all. Sam Frost says that what Paul was saying in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is that the Thessalonians, in the midst of persecution to be sure, but in the midst of that persecution, they were to be comforted in their hearts and in their minds and in their souls by the fact that Jesus had ascended, Acts chapter 1, had ascended to the Father. And there, in that ascension scene, Sam Frost argues, from Daniel chapter 7, we find flaming fire. Well, as I pointed out, folks, and this is reiteration, I understand that, but I want to bring us back up here, all right, up to speed. So Sam Frost changes the definition of anesis, which means relief from pressure. In the context, relief from the pressure, persecution. Paul wasn't promising that at all. To the Thessalonians, not at all. Paul wasn't saying, and how could he be? Paul wasn't saying at all, in any way, shape, form, or fashion, that God was going to give the persecutors of the Thessalonians persecution at the coming of the Lord, because he identifies the revelation of Jesus Christ as his ascension, not his parousia of judgment, but as at his ascension. Well, guess what, folks? God did not repay the persecutors of the Thessalonians with tribulation at Jesus' ascension. That's nonsense. You'll just have to excuse my bluntness. That's nonsense. But Paul's language is explicit. It is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are being troubled relief. Once again, relief. Relief from pressure, the pressure of persecution, when the Lord Jesus is revealed. Not in the fact that they're supposed to say, well, we're being persecuted constantly. We're being persecuted by the Jews, but we're going to take comfort in the fact that Jesus ascended to the Father. Now, did they rejoice that Jesus had ascended to the Father? Yes, but it was that faith that was the cause of their persecution. And that faith was not their relief from that persecution at the ascension. And I've suggested to you that Isaiah chapter 66 is in fact the passage upon which Paul is drawing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Now, by the way, Sam Frost is always boasting that he stands with church history, he stands with church scholarship, he stands with the creeds in his eschatology. Well, in this argument, Sam Frost stands totally alone. I have not been able to find even one early church writer. There's certainly no creed. I have not found a single biblical scholar of any reputation. I hadn't found a scholar of any kind that agrees with Sam Frost's position on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and I have challenged him repeatedly to cite some source. Now listen to me. I don't have a problem, although it always concerns me, to set forth what is an unprecedented argument, if the evidence supports it. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be coming out with a book very shortly entitled Temple to Telos, in which I will set forth a position that I have not found essayed anywhere. So, when I point out that Sam Frost has set forth an unprecedented argument, I'm not saying that automatically means that it's wrong. However, when Sam Frost boasts that he stands with church history and the creeds and scholarship, and then proceeds to set forth an argument that cannot be found anywhere in any of those sources, that's a little bit disingenuous. I make no such claim, okay? I make no such claim of standing with the creeds and of the church writers, etc., although I can quote many of the early church writers who on many passages make preterist statements. Okay, I've gone on long enough here. I just simply had to go back over some territory to bring you back up to speed to where we are. Isaiah 66, not Daniel 7, is the source and the background for 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. So very quickly, let me make one final point this morning, almost out of time. In Isaiah chapter 66, the Lord was talking about the time in which he was depreciating the value of the actual temple. Acts chapter 7:49, Stephen quotes Isaiah 66 verse 1 verbatim. God does not dwell in temples made with hands. Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build for me? Stephen quoted that, applied it to the Jews of his day and their attitude, telling them God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And for saying that, for quoting Isaiah 66, they killed him. Why? because they had turned the temple into their idol. They had turned the temple into a den of thieves. So said Jesus in John 2 and Matthew chapter 21. My Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all the nations. You have turned it into a den of thieves. Now notice Isaiah 66. He is describing a time in which he says, he who kills a bull will be as the one who kills a man. The one who sacrifices a lamb, as if he breaks a dog's neck. The one who offers a grain offering, as if he offers swine blood, which would be unclean, impure, and abomination. The one who burns incense, as if he blesses an idol. Just as they have chosen their own ways, and their soul delights in their abominations, watch this, so will I choose their delusions, and will bring their fears on them. Because, watch this, when I called, you did not answer. When I spoke, they did not hear. But they did evil before my eyes and chose that in which I do not delight. Now, the time was coming in which the worship at the temple would be an abomination. Does it mean that the temple itself would be an abomination? It meant their service in the temple would be an abomination. The house was still supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations. Their sin, and all you got to do is read Matthew chapter 23, and 6 curses, 6 woes that God pronounces upon Israel as a result of their abominable actions in and around and surrounding the temple. Notice what he says. When I called, they would not answer. Now this takes us right back to chapter 65, verse 1 and 2. And here's the kicker. Paul, in Romans chapter 10, 20 and 21, quotes these verses. When I called, you did not answer. As a result of Israel refusing to heed the gospel call, Isaiah said, God said through Isaiah, I will bring their delusions on them. I will bring on them that which they fear. Well, what do you suppose that was? The whole context is the temple and their abominable actions in the temple, which they knew historically would bring destruction on them. Now watch, very quickly. Paul applies Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66 to Israel of his generation. Now look, folks, this is a case of metalepsis. Metalepsis, a common hermeneutical practice of the first century in Jewish circles. When a speaker or writer quoted from part of an Old Testament prophetic background, they were bringing that entire prophetic background and context to the heart, to the mind of their reader or listener. So that means that when Paul in Romans chapter 10 quoted from Isaiah 65, quoted from Isaiah 66, when I called, they did not answer. And when he said, when Isaiah said, I will bring upon them that which they fear, I will bring their delusions upon them. When Paul quoted from Isaiah 65, 66, when I called, you did not answer, guess what? Paul was saying the judgment of Israel was near, because Israel of his day, of his generation, was not responding to the gospel call. And tomorrow, and by the way, that's precisely what we see in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Acts chapter 7, where Paul preaching and the Jews hated him and stirred up the persecution against the gospel and against the Thessalonian saints. See? They rejected the gospel Paul is threatening them with imminent judgment based on Isaiah 66. Folks, when you admit that Isaiah 66 is the source of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, when you admit that 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is the same as Matthew chapter 25, then that means that Matthew 25:31 and following was the prediction of Christ's coming in judgment of Old Covenant Israel in AD 70. I'm out of time. Here it is Monday. I've taken up 20 minutes. Okay, sorry about that. Well, not really. So anyway, I'll see you on the flip side with more from Isaiah 66.